Right, good morning everyone. I'm Caris from the CISI. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to CISI, everyone in this room and those watching on CISI TV. Just a very brief housekeeping note before we start. Please make sure your mobile phones are on silent. We're not expecting a fire alarm test, so if we do hear one, my colleagues will guide you just out of here and to the right, which is where our fire exits are. Particular welcome today to our guests from Chartered Bankers, who've travelled from Scotland to be here with us today. So today we will be hearing about the Chartered Bankers survey, produced in partnership with the Finance Foundation, which surveyed their members on the topics of diversity and progression in finance. Now you'll hear more about this excellent research later. You should all have some on your seats, and I would encourage everyone to read it in full. But I just wanted to draw out a couple of points about the research that I felt were particularly interesting. So firstly, I thought it was really striking that 20% of ethnic minorities felt that ethnic background was a significant barrier to progression at work. That's 20%. Only 10% of the other respondents thought ethnicity was a barrier at all. That's quite a gap. Clearly, we need to be having better conversations to understand the barriers that ethnic minorities face in the workplace. Secondly, still seems to be the case for many that it's not what you know, it's who you know, with half of the respondents raising that as an issue and, in fact, the biggest barrier to progression. I think this is really important because this is something that is so easy to miss and yet has such a big impact. Could be something as seemingly innocuous as only offering work experience or internships to relatives of current employees. I think that's one to really think about. And thirdly, of the most interest to me and my colleagues perhaps, is there are some really helpful pointers in the research as to how professional bodies can help support diversity and progression in finance. So I know the report highlighted several of the Chartered Bankers' excellent current initiatives, including their mentoring programme. Some of you here might be familiar with our Young Professionals Network at CISI. If you're not, and you're under the age of 35, I would really recommend having a look. We also work with our Education Trust to support young people from a wide variety of backgrounds develop transferable skills for the workplace. So clearly there's work being done, but this is an area where there is always more to do. So I'm really excited that we have a wonderful panel of speakers here today to discuss the report and the sector and situation more broadly. So I'm delighted to hand over to Joanne Murphy, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Chartered Bankers. Joanne, I very much look forward to hearing what I'm sure will be a very thought-provoking conversation. Thank you.
So much, and thank you to our Charter Body Alliance partner, CISI, for hosting today's event. My name's Joanne Murphy. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Institute, and I'm delighted to see such a diverse audience amongst us today as well, and I hope that means that the research will really resonate with you. My own journey at the Institute, I joined 5 years ago, and I'm proud to be the first female executive board member at the Institute. It only took the Institute 139 years to appoint a woman in situ, but actually it's 100 years since women actually were able to join the Institute and become qualified, and that's our anniversary of that's next year, and I'm equally very proud of that. One of the very first things that I did was I wanted to understand our membership more fully, and I was delighted to find that in our institute, which covers the whole of the UK, and particularly in retail and commercial banking, 53% of our membership is actually female. So we have a greater majority of female who are part of the institute and the professional body. However, like the banking profession, when you look at across the grades of membership, so for the most junior qualified to the most senior, you shift from around 68% at the entry-level qualifications to under 10% when you get to fellowship. So it's very much reflective of the industry, and it was important to understand why that disparity is there and what is the professional body that we could do to actually start to shift the dial for everyone across those groups. We we've been doing this research for a couple of years, this year in particularly, and with the Finance Foundation, and Hilary has led that research with us. And we were fortunate enough, as a membership body, our BAM classification of members, and we have a higher population than UK average, and they were able to support our research this year and actually develop some of the questions for us, which hopefully really adds texture to it. So really looking forward to today's panel discussion. I'm going to hand over to panel members to introduce themselves to you, and then we'll really just get into the questions more deeply. We're going to have an opportunity to stop at the end, really to get some questions back from you on anything to do with the topics raised in today's session. So hoping it's really really interactive. So thank you so much for coming out this morning. I hope you've managed to get a cup of coffee and something to eat before we start. But I'm just going to hand over initially to Naomi at the end, and we'll pass on from there.
Great, so hi everyone. My name is Naomi Alexander-Naidu. I'm the community manager at a charity called the Finance Innovation Lab, which is a charity trying to build a financial system that serves people and planet. And we do that in a variety of ways, but what we're best known for is incubating early stage innovators that are building financial products and services that have social and environmental aims. And we also, this year, have launched a new programme of work finding and supporting people within mainstream finance who are trying to change their institutions from the inside out. And for us, diversity and progression is really, really key to this work. We don't think that we can change the financial system if we work only with the demographics which are currently represented and currently have power within the financial system. So it's really great to be with you all today to discuss this topic.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Sonia?
Hi, my name is Sonia Barlow. I run an initiative called Like-Minded Females. We are a diversity inclusion consultancy. I graduated in 2015, went straight into the technology and fintech sector, found it extremely difficult, isolating, lonely, and most importantly, I didn't think that we were really trained on life skills, which is basically what you need to progress yourself in the career journey. I created a brunch 18 months ago, thinking that, you know, if I'm feeling this way, other people must be feeling this way too. No one showed up to brunch, but they did engage with online content. LinkedIn was our main kind of driver, and so I started sharing relevant content, news, articles, etc. Turns out challenges are being faced by everyone, regardless of gender, age, and that's where diversity comes in, is you have to make content inclusive enough that everyone feels it's safe enough for them to attend, for them to contribute, and most importantly for them to learn from. In a year, 12 months even, we've engaged with over 12,000 people. We have a social following of 9,000, and we are now changing the narrative of inclusion through life skill workshops, community building, and corporate training. So as of September this year, I've quit my full-time job in technology to run this day&I consultancy full-time. And really where we value add is, yes, talking to companies and talking to corporates about how they can be more diverse and inclusive and progressive, but also going back to universities and teaching them the professional skills that they require to go into the workplace, so that when they are applying for these jobs and they're inexperienced, at least they can form the experience from their university and take it forward. And that's kind of where I'm at.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. And we'll come on to that more in the questions about how do we develop that pipeline right from the start. So also, Tally.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Tally. I work at the Chartered Insurance Institute as People Engagement Director, responsible for several things, and one of them is talent. So for me, diversity, inclusion, progression is all about talent. I talk a lot about how do we unlock talent, and one aspect is creating a thriving environment where you can bring your authentic self to work. The organizational infrastructure enables you to grow, develop, and you have the opportunities to invest in your own learning and development as well. And that could be life skills or internal technical skills.
Thank you, Tally. And finally, Hilary.
Hello, I'm Hilary Cooper, Associate Director at the Finance Foundation. I'm actually a career civil servant, so I spent 25 years in the civil service, predominantly in the government economic service, and I started off as a labour market analysis and was involved in commissioning, directing and designing research. In that capacity, I then moved within the civil service policy and operational roles at senior level, and I spent 4 years in the east of England as Director of HR and Diversity. So it's got a range of skills. Since I left the civil service, I've been freelance, and I've been an associate director with the Finance Foundation, which is a think tank dedicated to researching issues that impact on the financial services sector and thinking about ways that things might be changed or improved. And in that capacity, I've worked twice now with the Institute on, this is the third survey of progression. I've worked on this one and the one before. This one's obviously got a much more explicit and upfront focus on black and minority ethnic, but it also looks at gender issues and at progression issues and barriers that everybody and anybody might feel that there are within their organisation. And really coming back to what Carrie said at the beginning, the biggest finding was that although there is a lot of positivity and optimism about progression, those who see barriers in their organisation still see networks of who you know as the most significant barrier, and that interacts with all sorts of other areas of disadvantage or exclusion.
And I think that does really lead on to sort of the first sort of area that we're going to look at, which is the sort of the transparency and the impact of who you know, and how does that actually the impact that has in creating barriers, the greatest barriers, and that was something that did come out in the research, and particularly for you know, different gender groups and ethnic minority groups. One of the things, there was a podcast recently in BBC which also highlighted this, and it did highlight, I think it said that it was institutional racism, you know, actually was prevalent for some organisations as well, and ultimately people gather or recruit around who they know and people like them, and that's something that we're finding difficult to overcome. So I want to really talk to the panel about how do we overcome that, and how do we look at what's really required, and is it just cultural change that's required to remove some of these barriers that exist? Tally, can I maybe come to you really for that sort of first point?
Absolutely, I think there's several things on that. I'd say it's the internal processes, so let's talk about recruitment first. It's having a really robust, transparent process, but I call it the inclusive recruitment process, so that there are, the concept of blind CVs, I think most of us now have inherited and adopted. It's ensuring that you have a balanced panel at interviews, so that when you are attending an interview, you feel welcome straight away. You feel actually there's an equal opportunity here, and there's a robust process in place when you're advertising and also working with recruiters. So one of the challenges is pushing the recruiters to think differently as well, and that takes a bit of a culture mind shift change. And I've written a whole paper on inclusive recruitment and the small nuggets of change that you could do to shift that. I also think another area that's really important is data. So when we look at gender pay gap, ethnicity pay gap, so ethnicity pay gap, as we know, it's linked consultation. But at CII, we led on disclosing the data, so capturing the data, disclosing it, understanding what are the nuances, what are the challenges, because ethnicity pay gap, collating the data, it is, first of all, under GDPR, personal sensitive data. It is very personal to an individual, and knowing when you're asking to collect it, the first instinct is, well, why? And a lot of work needs to be put behind the why we're collating it. And when you have the data, what it does is it enables you to look at the different pinch points, like gender pay gap. What are the pinch points of, so I wasn't surprised with the data, members could be 50-50, and when they get to fellowship level, there's probably around 10-20%. Our organisation is very similar. A lot of that is legacy, but what that data does is it helps us understand what interventions can we put together as an institute, chartered institute, but also as organisations. And for example, the interventions for opportunities for promotion. And one of the things I always talk about is work allocation. Do we provide an opportunity for everyone in our business to enable them to be allocated work that is outside of their current role? And for example, it could be as simple as coming to today. Have we invited someone that wouldn't typically come to an event like today so that they can network the power of networking and learning the skills of networking, learning about a new topic, so you could invite them to one of your CPD technical conferences so they can get to learn, and they don't have to work in that part of the business. And it's those small nuggets that starts to create that change of behaviours, mind shift, and also empowers the individuals to thrive and learn.
So it's starting from that individual, the very start. It's that very start of the journey, which sort of linked into Sonia's point as well about getting these life skills in place. And sort of the other initiatives that we see quite a lot, we hear about, and there's a bit of a split jury on, is unconscious bias and whether that training actually works. So Naomi, just coming to you, do you think that the unconscious bias, which is always cited as a barrier to progression, do you think that, you know, is training the answer, or cultural changes that what's more important?
So I think with unconscious bias, the first thing is to really understand what unconscious bias is, and what we interpret that to mean when that comes up in surveys like this. And obviously the key is in the word unconscious. So the idea of unconscious bias is it's biases that we have that we're not aware of, and thus the interpretation is often that we can't be fully held to account to those biases. So what I would say is unconscious bias absolutely is an issue, but Joanne, exactly as you referred to in your introduction, sometimes institutional racism is also the issue, sometimes institutional sexism is also the issue, and we need to be very, very careful when we talk about unconscious bias that we're not simply making palatable things which actually are very conscious and in some cases are institutional. So to give you an example from our work, we at the lab convene a network of women who are working in financial innovation across the sector, and the first event we ever had, we asked women to share their experiences and talk about some of the barriers they faced, as well as things that have enabled them to overcome or remove those barriers. And one of the things that came up was sexual harassment, and that's something that we know happens across financial services. And so that's something which is not unconscious bias, that's harassment. But women, because of processes and culture and all these sorts of things, don't necessarily always feel able to call that stuff out. And I think that that's even more the case when you look at race. So often people of colour don't think that they can say, oh, my manager is being racist to me, even if they make an explicitly racist comment, and they'll say, oh, I'm experiencing unconscious bias. So one thing I would say is always take kind of findings about unconscious bias with a pinch of salt. Unconscious bias does exist, but that's more like, oh, I, for some reason, find this person untrustworthy and I don't really know why, not when someone actually makes a racist comment. So all of that is to say, I think that unconscious bias training is useful. It's particularly useful for people, as Hallie was speaking about, who are doing recruitment, so that they're aware of those biases. But I also think training which looks at the structure of your organisation and looks at deep-seated, power and injustice is equally important. And if you only introduce measures to counter unconscious bias, you're not going to get where you need to be in terms of diversity and inclusion. And the one thing as well that I would add to that is it's also, so for us as a charity that are trying to build a fair, democratic and responsible financial system, when we talk about diversity and progression, it's progression for what? The reason that diversity and progression is important is so we can build a financial system that represents everyone, where different people have power and which serves everyone. And if we only go as far as speaking about unconscious bias but not actually fundamental power imbalances in financial services, then we're not going to get there. So unconscious bias training, great, but also look at other trainings which are, they're called different things. Sometimes they're called anti-oppression training, sometimes they're called structural inequality training. There's many providers that I can suggest, but I think really you need to do both.
I suppose the key though is that also don't get disheartened, because if you persevere and actually, a lot of the things that you can do is about getting the right sponsor. So if you can connect with somebody and build relationships, that is a way that you can overcome some of these barriers that you face as well. So it's not just about saying, oh gosh, this isn't going to change, or this is the historical structure that's there because that's how it's been since the start of time. It's about what are the things that you can do as well to sort of push the dial in these areas as well.
And if I could just add to that, I think what's really hopeful hopeful in this research, and that speaks to your point, is the different experiences for women and ethnic minorities. And I mean, in some ways that's disheartening, but what that shows is that all of these initiatives and all of the work that people have been doing over the past decades, which did start with women, and it would have potentially been better if it was a bit broader than that, but because it started with women, we can see that things have improved, and that's not only the case in financial services, but is the case across the financial sector, across the corporate sector, and that proves that initiatives do work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I think we should be cognizant that behaviours are shifting. And there are certain enablers for that. One is, I'm an HR director first and foremost, so for me it's the interventions, the HR interventions, but they're just policies. Unless the leadership team start to apply them and live them, that's where the culture shift changes, and it's starting to happen. So
yes, I was just going to say, I mean, it's visible in this survey, but also, I mean, the reports that have come out recently about the progress that has been made on women's representation on boards completely contrasts with the lack of progress, in fact the backward movement on black and minority ethnic. So I think you're right, there's a trailblazer, if you like. Yeah.
So it's back to it's the focus, isn't it? And back to the old, what gets measured gets done, so that attention and that focus.
So unconscious bias is extremely important because it's one training and one measure that we should all be providing in our workplaces, and it's shocking that it's not a given. It's not something which we go through as soon as we onboard new recruits and just kind of help them to learn the biases that they may have within a certain workplace and what they can be doing in this workplace to take it forward. It's something which companies now have to go and find, if that makes sense, or more than 3 people have to say we should have this training and they go and find it. But even with unconscious biases, I've delivered many trainings and workshops on unconscious biases, and a lot of the unconscious biases or the comments which are made, one, is due to a lack of cultural awareness. So if you don't know the correct information or information about a typical culture, therefore it also kind of correlates with miscommunication, because that person from a different culture, so let's just use the UK or Europe for an example, actually it's a given fact that those who are from France speak fairly different to those who are from England. And so if we're just talking about these two parallels, cultural awareness is key. Knowing that they communicate in differences is key. And so then if you start bringing in the actual ethnic minorities and those who are from a non-traditional Caucasian background, it's miscommunication, it's how we're aligning that. And it's very important. Unconscious bias training is important, but I would stress that we need to be giving this training or providing these training workshops or delivering them, to those who are decision makers, those who are managers and leads, or kind of, the top half of the hierarchy, because it seems that and I think to your training, membership and what you see in banking is the bottom half, there's a lot of diversity. There are females, there's ethnic minorities, we understand. Why is it that they're not getting to the top? Actually, there's the middle barrier. One of those barriers must be the unconscious bias we have when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to progression, when it comes to promotion. That line of people, that's who the unconscious bias training needs to go to, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are managing us.
And I think part of the issue and part of the reason that we started this research and we wanted to measure it over time was to understand, for us, when someone's coming to study with the Institute, why are we not seeing people who are in cohorts? Like, what decisions, who is it that, and actually sometimes it's not about that you're only grouping people together because they're a cohort doing it. It could just because the people are confident enough to put their hand up to say, I'll actually be the first one to do this. And it's how do we give people the confidence to put their hand up, even if they don't look like the other person, or even if they're not in the same groups. How do we build that confidence right from the start within organisations, that people, when they join an organisation, are confident enough that opportunities are equal for them, and that they have the opportunity to progress. And that's why it's really important that as the professional body that we continue to measure that, and we hold organisations to account for how they show that progression in future. I'm going to come on to looking at the hot topic of gender pay gap, and sort of why that exists, and really the issues underlying around that. I mean, one of the things I suppose we've tried to talk about some of the positive stuff. If we looked at something like a FCA measure, like the Senior Manager and Certification Regime, in 2005, the female representation in that was 17%. In 2019, it's 17% on that register. Also, for the BAM population, 14% of the population, FTSE 250, 6% representation. So don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand why we're seeing some of these big gaps and why they actually still exist, as much as things are being done to improve that over time. But I think just, Hilary, any other underlying issues here that are impacting on the gap overall that's wider than what we initially see in the headlines?
I mean, just to refresh on the gender pay gap exercise, the exercise for firms, employers with more than 250 staff who report the gender pay gap. It's been done twice now, and there's been almost no sign of change, obviously only 2 years apart. I think a really significant point, though, is that the financial services sector has twice the average gender pay gap, so that's something to be aware of. I've also looked at the official ONS stats, which cover all businesses, not just the larger ones, and the same story is true there, although because you can look over a long period with those data over decades, there is some closing of the gap. So although the gender pay gap is still enormous in the financial services sector, it looks like it's reducing slightly faster than the average. So, maybe, there's a small area for optimism there, but it's still on those figures over a third.
I think actually going back to some of the information about the firms, the largest firms that have got the systemic risk associated with them, they've actually progressed better. So like for the certification regime and stuff, they're up to 24%, yes. But it's the large firms that are making that difference. Right. It's the smaller firms, it seems to be that it's more.
I mean, the sort of brute statistics really are that if you are underrepresenting females in senior roles and overrepresenting them in junior roles, that is driving your gender pay gap. And so you then have to ask why. I mean, I think TSB 3 or 4 years ago did a study that apparently showed that most of their gender pay gap evaporated if you looked at quartiles and just looked at the seniority and junior issue. But then you have to say, so why? Why are women not, why they're overrepresented and recruited into junior roles? So overrepresented there and underrepresented at the senior roles. What is it about leadership, about barriers, about glass ceilings? Is it to do with childcare? What happens? What the distribution of caring responsibilities is? What happens when women have children? How they're helped or not helped to progress after that point, or even retention policies. So really, what are those sorts of issues? What are the broader cultural and organisational issues? These potential male-dominated networks that we've looked at, or are we looking further back at schools and educational choices and career choices? The sort of wider social context. So there's a huge amount of stuff there.
There's lots in there, and
I was going to ask if you could add to that.
Yeah, there's lots on there. So we've done quite a lot of work on this. If anyone wants the paper, it's on our website. Feel free to grab it. It talks about equal pay and how gender pay gap is not equal pay, and it talks about the different pinch points and interventions. Feel free, it's there. Absolutely, we can start from schools and the attraction from schools into the workplace. But if we just talk today about the workplace, I come back to what are the small nuggets that you can take as an individual, but also what your managers and leaders can do to enable you to grow and thrive. And I come back to one aspect, the work allocation. I think it's a really important one. How often is a man invited to work on a really high exposure project or a task as opposed to a woman? That's one. Or someone who identifies from an ethnicity background. And then we talk about intersectionality, because we're not one-dimensional. So I think that's really important, that we keep challenging. And all I say is put your hand up and say, can I get involved in that project, or can I come along? What's the worst that can happen? They'll go, no. Well, why? And I think the second piece is absolutely the caring. So we've just, as the Institute for Insurance, we put a flexible working pledge for the insurance profession. And it is about encouraging flexible working for people irrespective of what gender. So, and if we look at the shared parental leave, how many men have taken shared parental leave? How many men have asked for flexible working or part-time working to care for their children or care for their elderly? Because if you think about it, well, with the data is there, those who are in their 40s are now sandwich carers, elders and children. So, men asking for flexible or part-time working, the first response is, what's the impact on my career? Okay, well, we should be creating, first of all, an infrastructure that enables you to grow and thrive in your career, irrespective if you're working part-time or flexible working, and irrespective of what gender you are.
So Sally, would you say then that encouraging men to take equal paternity leave and actively participate in things like parental leave, that could make a significant difference?
It's absolutely fundamental. That will start to change the culture shift. So if we first of all define what is culture, culture is behaviours. So it's the aggregate behaviours of us as an organisation that creates the culture that we work in. And if our culture embraces and encourages us, men, us women, us as people working in the organisation to work flexibly, and particularly if you've got senior members of the team who are working flexibly or part-time or taking shared parental leave, that sends a very strong message in the business, says okay, and when I come back into the workplace, my position hasn't altered significantly.
Nice to add to that. So through our research and through the community events that we've conducted, some of the issues, and it definitely is getting better, but some of the issues that come up when we talk about gender pay gap is, for example, those who identify as female find it more difficult to actually go and negotiate, to go and talk about promotions, because they have these stigmas. If I go and ask my manager too many times, they're not going to give me these extra workplace allocations. They don't promote me because they don't think I'm good enough. And so and studies have shown, psychology has shown, I have a partner who works in banking, even the difference between myself and him, every year when he has his annual pay review, he goes in with an Excel sheet to say, this is what I've done, this is how it's contributed to the business, this is the difference it's made. Whereas I'd be like, I don't, my first few years I was like, I don't really want to ask, because what if they fire me? He's like, that doesn't make any sense. I was like, okay, so no one's ever taught me how to negotiate. No one's ever taught me how to go with somewhat business plan and proposal taken forward. So one, we really need to encourage negotiation skills, open conversations, and safe spaces within our workplace where individuals can feel safe enough to go to their managers, to their leads, to their coaches or mentors and buddies and say, can you please help me create a business plan where I can go ask for more pay, or where I can challenge the promotion that I've been currently given, because I know through conversations in the kitchen that I think I'm being paid less versus the work I'm doing. And the second, to the parental leave, actually a lot of people don't know about shared parental leave and the policies. It's astonishing. We did an event with Taboola, for example, who are an internet advertising platform, and the man on the panel, he was one of the first in the business to go and ask for shared parental leave. They never had policies in the business for shared parental leave, because as a business, unconsciously they thought this is only what mothers do. So why would we put it in place for fathers? My brothers just had a baby. They didn't know anything about shared parental leave. Neither did his business. So he had to go and educate them on the laws and regulations and the rules, and help them to establish the procedure. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of it comes down to the lack of education. We've either been presented and we've provided ourselves, or the lack of confidence and education we have going into our business and putting our hand up and saying, actually, I want parental leave. This is what it says on the websites, on the YouGov website, on kind of any research. Let's work together to try and make this happen.
So sort of that links back into lots of things that we've already talked about,
Yeah,
which is
exactly.
like having that confidence to actually to raise your hand, to volunteer, to put yourself forward, to speak up, and to push that dial yourself and make sure that you're doing what you can to push that forward.
And if you can't do it verbally, write an email. If you can't write an email, ask your mentor, your sponsor, your coach to guide you in the workplace. Like there's various avenues in order to do so. If you can't do any of them, then we've already mentioned, but ask your work colleagues or your managers or your leads or whoever it is to attend an event with you, so that the event showcases the problem area which you're discussing, and rather than you having to educate them, the event and the panel does it on your behalf, because we also have to think about personalities.
Yeah. So moving on to sort of how do firms move the dial really for gender and ethnic minorities and to get an inclusive working environment. I mean, one of the things is the Hampton-Alexander report came out last month, and that actually stated that next year 50% of all senior roles would have to be given to women to actually achieve the 2020 target, which seems pretty a major target to put into place if that was to happen, to achieve the government's own targets on that. But looking at that, anything that we could do for leaders, should there be targets or even quotas or even penalties and incentives? Tally, I don't know what you think around that.
So I think the leadership, working with the leadership team is really important to change and encourage them to shift the culture and lead with the interventions that we've spoken, with some of the interventions we've spoken about, because there's so many more. I do believe in creating those opportunities based on merit in terms of appointment. I also believe that creating opportunities not only within the business but externally for colleagues is really important through events like today, through the networking. And I think leaders are in a really good position to create those platforms that enables that culture shift. And I think what is really amazing and powerful about today is here we are as a Chartered Body Alliance coming together to create that shift. How impactful and powerful is that? That for me is what I mean by moving and transferring some of the knowledge, the skills and the talent within our professions.
I mean, yes, I do think that, that firstly organisations should have a diversity and inclusion lead at really senior level, and that should be embedded in a policy and in targets that senior managers are assessed against, potentially that their pay and progression is linked to that, and it can be incentivized in various ways. But I think you really need to do that. And just thinking about this discussion about shared parental leave and people not knowing and so on, there is another issue around shared parental leave, which is that it's actually financially quite disadvantageous to men to take it, unlike to women, because maternity pay is there are policies that a lot of which are much closer to full salary replacement, whereas men have to take generally quite a big hit. So if organisations are really serious about this, they should have a policy. They should have an advertised, communicated policy, so that people don't have to be courageous to ask about it. It should just be there and put out and known about. But they should be addressing the structural disadvantage to men taking a greater role, taking shared parental leave. The stigma maybe of a man asking to work flexibly as opposed to a woman asking to work flexibly. So I do think that unless this happens, unless there's leadership, you know, and unless that is then embedded in how your pay and performance is assessed, it's just going to take a hell of a lot longer.
Yeah.
And you're not walking the talk, are you?
I have to. I'm really surprised about the shared parental leave. That many organisations are like, wow, that I've just learned something new. Our policies out there, we communicate it. We've tried to make it simple because it is a complex policy. We've equalised, so to handle this, you know, men are not worse off. Because on one hand, we're trying to address inclusion, but then we're being we're excluding men, and that doesn't add up. So we've equalised so that financially it's as good for men as it is for women. And I think it's one of those areas that still needs the conversation because there's still the stigma around it. And the more we can continue the dialogue on this, hopefully it will start to shift more.
And I think one of the things that's come through year after year in the research that we've done from the start is that all of the members that responded have said that in having a more inclusive workplace benefits everybody in the workplace, so not just certain groups. Actually, it's beneficial to all, so the more inclusion you can have right the way through an organisation, that will have a positive impact on everyone.
So from the stats, so McKinsey and Forbes have released some stats, and from what I remember, inclusive workplaces and diverse workplaces increase profitability by 17%, productivity by 23%, and can add over 3 billion into the economy. So I just think it's shocking that we have these figures in front of us and the data is saying be more inclusive if you want more profits and revenue, and yet we are just not considering the steps that we can take internally to do so. And so steps that companies can start doing today, for example, are working with communities. There are tons and tons of communities out there, so Women in Tech, Like-Minded Females, Ada's List, just to name 3. For women that are looking for a community and for those new opportunities, as well as the institutes that we obviously have represented today, how can you work closely with communities to understand the females who are there, who you can then train up to progress into senior roles? And also, second to that, you know, us as those who identify as women or ethnic minorities or kind of non-confident middle-class men, let's say, who, you know, Caucasian men, we need to become more confident in applying for opportunities. Because the stats show that as a woman, you will only apply to an opportunity if you meet 90 to 100% requirements. Now, if a job description is 3 pages long, you've already lost me at page 1, because I think I'm not ready, I'm not capable. Whereas a man will most likely apply based on his future self, whereas a woman would present their current self. So as workplaces, what can we start doing? If you're trying to hit these quotas or these agendas, make it really easy for your applicants to feel like they can be involved, like they can progress, like they can be a part of your business. Cut down your requirements from 17 to 5. Make sure that we've already mentioned, I think Tali mentioned, make sure that in your interview process there's always someone representing either a woman or a man or intersectionality, so that you feel like you can be represented. And then when we talk about the pipeline, you know, new age pipeline, if you're trying to create quotas and to trying to encourage the new generation into your business, you have to be doing quite a lot and a lot more, because the new generation are all about value, social impact, social good and representation.
So yeah, I think just building on from that, I mean, we know that actually if we take this in a global context, wiping out all forms of discrimination actually would hugely increase the world's productivity and profitability, and actually raise the level of income for everyone across the globe and reduce poverty. But if we take that to a more local level, Naomi, is there anything that we can learn from other industries or other people that do that really well, that have got it right when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah. So I wanted to say one point on the quota piece first, which relates really to Sonia's points about the kind of business case for diversity, or I don't quite like to call it that, which is that I think with quotas, the way that they're framed really, really matters too. And I think that for so long they've been framed in a very negative way of it's something that we have to do, and it's something that holds us back. And I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but I've been at so many events or workshops around different kind of diversity characteristics that end up just being a big debate about quotas and targets, and it kind of like stifles it and doesn't get it any further. So I think one thing with whether it's a quota or whether it's a target is reframing it to acknowledge the value of diversity that Sonia spoke to. And that matters, one, for not getting us stuck on that debate, but it also matters because of the culture piece, because of the experience that people actually have when they then are hired, because that's something that we've really heard, especially from people of colour in our community, that being treated as a token hire or being treated as a quota hire is as much of a barrier as being hired in the first place. So I think that's really important to note, and we can all think about that when we speak about quotas and targets and what we're actually trying to achieve. In terms of good examples, I agree that really the best examples are coming from communities, and they are often not they're often kind of independent communities which are set up to address diversity challenges rather than in-house at particular firms or businesses. So Sonia mentioned a few, Ada's List. In the kind of tech space that we work in, there's really fantastic initiatives to support people right through their career journeys. So there's Foundivine, which supports underrepresented founders and takes people that have never necessarily seen themselves as entrepreneurs or people with tech skills, and does kind of week-long or weekend-long workshops to get them to that point. And there's the YSYS community, which do amazing stuff, again, on changing the face of tech and entrepreneurship, diversity, VC, and so forth. The challenge, though, and this is where I'm struggling a bit more to come up with great examples, is how you go from initiatives for particular minorities, whether that's on gender or whether that's on race, disability, and so forth, to an inclusive culture for everyone. And that's something, actually, as I've been doing this work, that I'm struggling with as well, because what people often want is a safe space, a community where they feel at home, where they feel like they're not the only person from that group, and so forth. And so we, as many people have done in this space, the way that we have answered that is to create particular communities. So we have a Women in Financial Innovation community. We recently did an event for people of colour. I'm planning next year to do ones on disability, on mental health, and LGBTQI, and so forth. But how do we then bring that together? Because often what that does is, at the beginning it's fantastic because people can share their experiences, but then you end up with a very siloed approach. So that is, a challenge which is really front of mind for me. I mean, one organisation that I think are doing pretty well on this in our space is Monzo. And to come back kind of to the data point, one thing I really admire about what Monzo are doing on the diversity front is their diversity data is very detailed. They look at every single ethnic group. They don't just look at the kind of ethnic minorities level, and that's really important in financial services, because the experience for Asian people in financial services versus black people is very different, and we often speak about it as if it's the same. It's absolutely not. Asian people actually in finance and in tech are doing quite well. Or equally between gender, so Asian men are doing pretty well, Asian women are among the lowest paid, and so Monzo have really broken down that data. And I think that's something that we should all be doing as much as possible. But the other thing I would say on places that are doing it well is that, as you said at the beginning, there's always more to be done. And so I think if you think you're doing it well, and I've spoken to many people that tell me they're doing it fantastically, then you're probably not looking at the whole picture. Because again, when we hold events for people from these groups and they share their experiences, one thing that we've heard often is like, different place, same I won't say the words, but like essentially people move around industry and expecting a new experience and have read great things about a particular organisation, and actually they arrive in each organisation and find the same challenges. And so none of us should be complacent about the efforts we're doing, essentially.
And I think that, just to build on that point, I think that leads into the sort of the role of the professional bodies, because that actually is where we have an opportunity to cross and dissect all different groups, because there's a common purpose and the roles of the professional bodies and how they work and what they're there to do for greater good for society. And if we link that into creating a sustainable society, that means an inclusive inclusive organisations and an inclusive professional body. And I think that sort of links back to the work that we've done, and really how the professional bodies, how we can really help to increase the diversity and right across the banking and financial services industry and its leaders. So Tali, I don't know if you've got something you want to add to that?
We have a real opportunity here as professional bodies to influence the shift of culture and to influence some not only for leadership but also for attracting talent. So for example at the CII we have volunteers around the UK who go into schools. There's again a community programme that goes into schools and encourage it. First of all, it's financial inclusion, but two, it's attracting them to insurance. So how often when you were at school or university was insurance on your radar as a profession? Not really, right? So we're starting from grassroots. We're also working with some communities about how do we attract talent into our profession from less privileged. You know, for me, let's talk about social mobility. I think that's really important. We're not, you know, social mobility is just a conversation that's starting. So we're working with some, like the brokerage in London, to how do we work and partner with them to attract talent into our profession. So we can lead on some of that and collaborate with other organisations within our sector.
Well, I'd be interested to hear what you think, you know, your professional body can.
So I think actually one of the ways that we will have an influence next year is that the FCA are about to launch a new register that will require professional individuals to be registered. And that means that each of for CII, CISI and the Chartered Banker Institute, we'll all have a register of professionally qualified members that will feed into the FCA directory. And this means that the measure that we're currently seeing for the reporting regimes, we will actually see what that looks like in terms of the physical dynamics of who are holding senior or qualified positions across the industry. So I think that's one way that professional bodies can really hold the foot to the fire, because it will be very, very visible for everybody to see. The other thing for our own professional body, for the Chartered Banker Institute, is that we will look at our whole fellowship programme. So we are very, very keen to make sure that we absolutely shift the dial in that, and we'll be taking positive action next year to ensure that we take the steps to make sure that our institute is as inclusive as it should be and as representative of the membership as it should be, because that actually is the only thing that will mean that the Chartered Banker Institute and other professional bodies and organisations will go on for another 144 years as if it's fully inclusive. So I'm just conscious of time, and I'm really keen that we've spoken a lot, and we could probably talk all day about this subject and different thoughts on it, but I just really want to give you the time to ask us some questions as well. So just really coming out to the audience, if there's anything that anybody would like to ask any of the panel members, I'd welcome any questions from anyone. I think we've got a roving mic there. Do you just want to say your name as well? That would be super.
So my name's Sammy Okafor. So I'm one of the co-chairs for the RBS Global Multicultural Network, and I just wanted to share actually the power of having employee-led networks. Really powerful. So some of the successes we've seen is starting this cultural shift around educating. Don't think this might works, but around educating. Is it working? Yeah? Okay, cool. Around educating our colleagues and the power of using the networks to be able to educate people. So being able to do things like educating people around faiths and the impacts that makes, educating leaders around that, and really start to have some really good conversations around race in the workplace and all those. So I just want to just, if corporates don't have that, it's a definite great tool to have. And we see ourselves very much as the voice of the employees. So we've been able to work closely with the HR, senior leaders, and start to really share with them what in particular our Bain colleagues are currently saying around some of the challenges and barriers that they have. So that's one. My main question is around, we know that senior leaders, CEO and CEO -1, they get this and they write the strategies around it, but the main people who deliver in organisations, the middle layer. That middle layer are the people who actually deliver for the organisations. And how do we engage the CEO -2, CEO -3, CEO -4 layers? Because those are the ones who really make it happen or not. So my question is, how do we really engage them?
Okay, thank you for that. Does anybody want to?
I think that's a great question. And that's something I refer to as, new generation already kind of have that mindset. CEOs know what they have to do. It is the middle layer because they're significantly making the decisions. The first thing I'd say is, if as a company you don't have internal communities, you have to start having them, and they should be intersectional. One community does not represent everyone. The second point to that, though, is the community is not responsible for diversity and inclusion. That's still up to the business. We've had a lot of challenges from the events that we do and workshops that we conduct, saying, I've started the BAME network, but now for some reason it's up to me to make the change, when that's not my day job. I'm doing it because I feel important, and it's important. We've had other people who've said, we started the BAME network, but we've stopped because actually it's taking up too much of our time and responsibility versus our day job. To your point with middle management, ultimately I significantly think it comes down to training, education, awareness. And if you cannot do that internally, I'd highly suggest to have someone external come and facilitate. I facilitated over 30 workshops this year alone. Majority of them have been because, for some reason, middle management tend to listen to an expert who's coming from external, who has the stats, who has the data, who has the tips, the tricks, the action points, rather than the internal colleagues, because they've seen the successes they've had outside of the workplace. And if that's something which is not within your budget, then it is very much giving them the educational and the awareness piece to say, this is the problems that our network have identified. Here are the events or workshops that we've proactively seeked that we think you can go and attend, and it will help educate you.
So I think putting aside budget, you're right. I think so. I think for me, I call them the small nuggets all the time, because the more you add to them, it starts to have a ripple effect. You've got some awesome network groups, invite them, and keep inviting them. And keep inviting them until they come along and start to experience. Because I always say, no one walks in your shoes, they're lived experiences. And if you can get them to come and live your experience for a moment, and I've got examples of this where I've done it in my business, you create that shift. The first time you invite them, they'll find a reason not to come along. The second time you invite them, they'll find another reason. And the third time you go, no, do you know what? I've looked at your diary. I know you're free. Come along. You'll have some. You can. It's again how we frame it. Find a way to frame it that they can come along, and then start creating the ripple. And then start to invite them to write the blogs and get them to start owning some of the content. It's all for me about engagement. Because the engagement then leads to education and awareness. The awareness then leads into actions and behaviours, because they've started to experience for a moment that lived moment. And I think that's where some of the power comes in. But that middle layer takes a while. The other element, so very quickly, is it in the appraisals? Are they getting measured on it? And I'm not necessarily talking about bonuses. That's a different conversation. But some of it could be just about their behaviours, their measurements, their objectives, their recruitment. So when they're recruiting, do they have not targets in terms of gender, but what are their measures?
I think that's a really good point, and I think RBS actually are quite trailblazing in what you've done. They're actually one of the notable organisations that have really shifted the dial really quickly. So I think they've got great work and great accomplishments with the organisation. But I think having that sort of positive incentives to make sure, because people are human, they're under a lot of pressure. Everyone's got different challenges within their organisation, and we tend to call that middle layer permafrost because it's difficult to get into. But actually, if you can positively incentivise people, because I think if people are encouraged and nurtured and they participate, then that can definitely make a difference. Hilary, you had something you wanted to add?
I was going to partly say that it's about appraisal and incentivisation, but I think it can also be really supported by processes. So if you have you know, a recruitment process where you make sure that you have objective criteria that are justifiable, and that everybody gets asked the same questions in their interviews, and that interviewers are recording, and that they can then justify after the event why one person, you know, was assessed in one way and another in another way, and that you do equality audits, that you know, you collect data at that recruitment phase, or even at the pay and promotion phase, to identify if particular groups are you know, being fairly represented or equally represented in those recruitment and pay and so on processes. And if they're not, you know, you then talk to that middle group about, you know, well, do you know why this is happening? You know, so I think you've got to give them the tools and the processes, as well as the training and the incentives.
Data, and they love data.
And I think there are structural things, and I was going to say that, I mean, just from my own point of view, I started my working life in the early 1980s, and you know, I've had a long working life. Probably 2/3 of my working life I've worked part-time, and I was enabled to do that in the civil service because they have active policies about requesting flexible working. At one point I had a term-time only contract as a manager, and I challenged people who said you can't do term-time only as a manager, and I said I think I can, and I did. So, you know, and we made sure that all posts were advertised as open fully to full-time or part-time. And I think this is all about structures and processes, and I think, you know, they do over time, they work in terms of processes, but they work in terms of mindsets as well.
Thank you so much for your question. Hope that answered it. Has anybody else got anything that they would like to ask? Let's chat to one over here.
Thank you all for your insights. There's so much I want to talk to you all about, like offline. So just the point around shifting the narrative. The narrative seems to be continuously shifting and evolving, and it is moving in a direction. I mean, we've had women's networks evolve into more balanced networks across men and women. We've had D&I being reframed as I&D to make sure inclusion is there. You know, education is shifting from the out groups to kind of the in groups, and you know, culture has been an HR initiative, which is now shifting towards a CEO and a COO initiative. My question to you guys is, where do you think the next evolution will be, and how do you see it evolving?
Oh, Naomi, is that one for you maybe?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've got to say, on the D&I versus I&D thing, I think like we shouldn't over-celebrate those sorts of narrative shifts, because, I mean, like, is there any difference? And I mean, I've been to many like talks and events and stuff where that is seen as this like major step forward, and it's like it's literally the same words. But so I actually think that the next step, or I hope, and I do see this happening, particularly in the charity sector where I work, is talking about structural imbalances of power and using words that we don't like to use in this country, like racism, like sexism, speaking candidly about class and about social mobility, and more people are having those sorts of brave conversations. But I think that's where we have to go, and I think that the fact that there are more and more initiatives, communities, consultancies, training providers that are offering services to support people with those sorts of conversations is a really, really good sign. It's difficult for a multitude of reasons. It's difficult because those are really, really difficult conversations to have. Talking about behaviour change is difficult. Talking about structural change is exceptionally difficult. It's also tough because, you know, British politeness and the culture that we have in this country makes those conversations particularly painful, but they're starting to happen. And if they can happen in the charity sector where I work, which doesn't really have resources often for trainings and external people to come in and that kind of thing, then I hope that sectors like financial services and like tech that do have those resources can really lead the way in having those brave conversations.
I would agree with that. A lot of the shift that I've seen just over this past year, right? So I started January or started this year being like gender. Not gonna lie, gender is just, it's very 2019. Like 2020, the last 3 months, and I've already got loads, neurodiversity. So you're talking about yes, intersectionality is there and we should be talking about it, but also talking about the different, so for those who don't know neurodiversity, it's very simply how people's brain works. So your brain works differently, ADHD, mental health, depression, for example, autism. How can we understand how different people work and their brain works, and then how can we facilitate them to work in a role or with projects or in a time, or adapt to them so that we can also enhance their productivity, make them productive, help the business, and create this safe space for them to be themselves. So neurodiversity hopefully will be a hot topic of 2020, because we don't talk about it enough, and we should. 1 in 5 of us in the UK suffer from mental health. 10% of us are autistic. 3% of us have ADHD. Those numbers are quite big and significant when you think of the workplace.
I think though that absolutely links to Naomi's point,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because actually you're going to have the ugly conversations
Yeah,
first.
no, fair.
Because you're then linking into disability discrimination as well.
Yeah.
So another discrimination, and it is about talking about the hard stuff. There's a really great organisation called Fearless Futures that is really, it's a great programme, but when you're looking at the structural barriers, historical biases, then if you want to go through the mill for yourself, then that's a good programme to put organisations on and into linking with. Go and see what they are doing. Really interesting, they're doing that worldwide as well now. They're really growing and developing. I'm just really conscious of time. I wonder if we can squeeze any more questions in. I don't know if there's anything else. One more from the audience. Sure. We might need to respond to you really quickly, I think, as well.
I heard it said that the gender diversity battle started approximately 10 years ago, roughly. I think somebody mentioned that. And that's why the effect of that change is visible now. How long do you think it will take for the ethnicity battle to see the changes that we're seeing on the gender side?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm actually maybe going to hand over to Hilary in this one. My own view on it though is that I think the gender battle's been going on for more than 100 years since we got the right to vote, to be honest, not 10 years. And that's quite sad when you look at the progress that's been made until now. What I think is really what's really inspiring is how much people are talking and moving the dial now, how much we're raising these difficult topics and how much we're putting focus on them. And I'm hoping that the focus on these areas means that we get much more momentum. So just as technology takes time to be embedded, and it takes a long time to get there, but it builds momentum over time and we see leaps and changes. I'm hoping that we start to see leaps when it comes to inclusion rather than this phased 100 years plus that it's taken us to get where we are today from a gender perspective. Hilary, have you got anything on that?
That's absolutely right, and I think you're right on one level that in terms of sort of big public discourse, CEO level, government level, maybe the big push has been over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of mainstreaming it. But I mean, in the mid-1980s, I was representing my trade union within the civil service on the Gender Equality Network. In terms of initiatives, and obviously, big push in the 60s, 100 years ago, the vote. So there's been lots and lots historically on gender. I think that you may be right that the sort of the networking, the sort of stuff that I was doing in my workplace in the 1980s on gender, maybe that's where, a lot of what other panel members have talked about and people have talked about now on black and minority ethnic diversity is really starting to take off. And so you have to say it may take another generation before that gets into the big public discourse, although the fact that that gender showed the way, maybe that will get it there more quickly. But I think it's obviously it's an evolution, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Just very quickly, I think the generation coming in won't be tolerant. So I think they will enable us to shift things in. I can only speak in organisations. Help us shift the organisational culture. I can't put a time frame on it, I don't know, but I think that's a real catalyst. And I think the fact that we're all here today having a conversation and having these little nuggets of learning that we can take either into our workplace or our resource groups or our own individual actions and behaviours, aggregate changes like that starts to create more of a ripple.
Yeah, I think I'm just following on. As someone who goes to universities and speaks to young professionals, they won't be tolerant of companies who do not have representation, fair representation, either from a website and engagement perspective to interview round to going into businesses. And so businesses, in order not to lose talent and to be very frank with you, to save money in re-recruitment costs, they will make a change. But also to your point, we also have to think historically. In 2011, the census, 14% of us who identify as BAME. The census before that, there was less than 8. Obviously now we've increased in those numbers, and so we've also increased the numbers that are going into some form of education or going into the workplace who are from an ethnic minority background. And just being in the room here today, we're fairly represented. So if we show up to these places, if we speak up, if we raise our hands, but just consciously, if we show up, we will start making a difference and impact, because the institutes that are presenting, the institutes which are delivering, the institutes on the panel will see your faces, will see your voices, will hear them, and they will start to take them back into their businesses. And that's how we make a significant change.
So I'm really conscious of time, and I just really want to thank everybody for taking the time this morning to come along to the event. There's still, if you want to ask any individual questions, you're more than welcome to ask the panel members that as we finish up. I'd just like to thank the panel for coming along and sharing their knowledge and expertise, to our Chartered Body Alliance partners, CISI, for supporting their event today, and to the team, the marketing team that got the event all set up for us. So thanks very much for coming along and your time this morning. Thank you, everybody.